What's going on, everybody? Khalipa's Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, we're going to be doing a quick comparison between the Motorola Moto G Stylus 5G 2022 and the Motorola Moto G Stylus 4G 2022. Now, before we go any further, as always, I do want to remind you to go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And if you want to learn more about either of these phones individually, I will be linking to several other videos about them in the description, as well as some information about pricing and availability. But with that being said, let's get into it. So with the Moto G Stylus 5G, we're getting a 6.8-inch 120Hz IPS LCD display with a resolution of 1080p, a PPI of 395, and an aspect ratio of 20.5:9. With the Moto G Stylus 4G, we're getting a 6.8-inch 90Hz IPS LCD display with a resolution of 1080p, a PPI of 396, and an aspect ratio of 20.5:9. So as you can see here, these displays are almost identical, the only real difference being the refresh rate, which I personally don't really consider to be that big of a difference. Sure, it's going to make the movement on the screen with the Moto G Stylus 5G a little bit faster and smoother, but honestly, can you even really tell? In my experience, when you're actually using the phones, you're not going to see a huge difference. Now, maybe if you're consuming a lot of content like streaming videos, playing games, stuff like that, you might notice just a tiny bit, but honestly, these displays just really aren't that different, and I wouldn't really use that as a deciding factor between these two phones. But that being said, both phones do have really good displays. The 1080p resolutions are going to give them great images. The 20.5:9 aspect ratios are going to give them taller and more narrow form factors. So if you're doing something like streaming videos in landscape mode, for example, you're going to get a more immersive experience. And if you're doing something like reading an article or scrolling through social media, with these phones, you'll be able to fit more content on the screens without having to scroll as much. Another thing I do want to point out is that for IPS LCD displays, the viewing angles are actually surprisingly decent. So if you're outside in the sun, for example, these phones might be a little bit easier to see than other phones with the same display technology. Now, when it comes to storage, this Moto G Stylus 5G has 256GB of internal storage, and this Moto G Stylus 4G only has 128GB. I'm pretty sure if you get either of these phones through a carrier, they're only going to have 128 anyway. But regardless, keep in mind both of these phones are going to have plenty of storage for the average user. I do think in most situations 128GB will be fine, and both phones do have microSD card expansion as well. For security features, both of these phones have fingerprint scanners right here on the power keys. Definitely a great spot for a fingerprint scanner. It's kind of interesting because last year's version of the Moto G Stylus 5G had it on the back instead, but I personally like it a lot better here. And in addition to the fingerprint scanners, both phones have face unlock as well. But starting with the Moto G Stylus 5G, let's give these fingerprint scanners a try and see how well they work. There we go, one more time. And there we go. Moving on to the Moto G Stylus 4G. There we go, one more time. And there we go. So as you can see, both fingerprint scanners worked real well, no issues whatsoever. And again, remember, both phones do have face unlock too, so if you want to use that instead, you always can. Now, taking a look at the camera setups here, honestly, these camera setups are literally identical. They have the same exact design for the front-facing camera, and these cameras are both 16 megapixels. Then on the back, we got triple camera setups here, with 50 megapixel main cameras, 8 megapixel ultra-wide cameras that also double as macro cameras, and 2 megapixel depth sensing cameras. So honestly, this is one of the rare cases where you have the exact same camera setup. Honestly, I didn't really notice much of a difference in quality either, but in general, these camera setups have pretty much all the features, including ultra-wide cameras and macro cameras, and I always thought it was really cool how they combine the ultra-wide camera and macro camera into one. The 22 iterations of the Moto G Stylus are pretty much the only phones I've ever seen do that, and the photos they take are really good. So if you're taking a lot of photos and you want a wider variety of features, you won't go wrong with either of these phones. Now for video, unfortunately, neither of these phones can record in 4K, and with the Moto G Stylus 4G, that is a bit of a downgrade, so that's kind of disappointing because the Moto G Stylus 4G 2021 could record in 4K, but with the Moto G Stylus 5G, nothing's really changed. But aside from that little drawback, again, the camera setups are great with these phones, and the photo and video quality is great for both of them. Now, as far as RAM and processor go, with the Moto G Stylus 5G, we're getting 8GB of RAM with the Qualcomm Snapdragon 695 5G processor. With the Moto G Stylus 4G, we're getting 6GB of RAM with the MediaTek Helio G88 processor. Now, the real obvious difference between the two is that with the Moto G Stylus 5G, we are getting 5G connectivity, whereas we're not with the Moto G Stylus 4G. Now, I'm sure you probably knew that going into this video, but in general, that's really one of the main differences between these two phones overall. So of course, if you do want a 5G phone, then the Moto G Stylus 5G is going to be the one to go with. But if you don't care about 5G, then you might still want to consider the Moto G Stylus 4G. Now, that being said, I did run Geekbench 5 benchmark tests on both of these phones, and with the Moto G Stylus 5G, we're getting a single core score of 622 and a multi-core score of 1928 328. With the Moto G Stylus 4G, we're getting a single core score of 368 and a multi-core score of 1304. Now, one kind of funny thing I've been hearing is a lot of people seem to be saying the Moto G Stylus 4G actually performs better than the Moto G Stylus 5G. I haven't personally experienced that, so I can't really verify it, but I'm guessing that if that is the case for some people, it must have something to do with the network. But again, I can't really speak for anyone else. In my personal experience, the Moto G Stylus 5G has been a little bit faster than the Moto G Stylus 4G, but honestly, despite what these test results might suggest, you're not going to see a huge difference in performance unless you're doing something really high-end like mobile gaming, and even then, neither of these phones are going to be anywhere near flagship level. Something like a Samsung Galaxy S21 FE or a Google Pixel 6a or even an iPhone SE is going to absolutely blow these phones out of the water in terms of performance. So if you really want a higher end device with really strong performance, then I would suggest looking into one of those entry-level flagship phones. But with these phones in general, although the Moto G Stylus 5G is technically, I guess, the faster of the two, and that has been my experience personally, the difference is really not going to be huge, and the Moto G Stylus 4G, despite not looking great on paper, is definitely not a slow phone by any means. Now, as far as the battery goes, both of these phones have 5000 mAh batteries, but the Moto G Stylus 5G supports 15 watt fast charging, and the Moto G Stylus 4G supports 10 watt fast charging. Now, honestly, an extra 5 watt fast charging isn't really going to make a huge difference, but if you do want the absolute best fast charging you can get between the two, then the Moto G Stylus 5G will have a slight advantage. But in my experience, both phones do charge up decently fast, and in general, if you're looking for a phone that has great battery life and longevity, you're not going to go wrong with either of them. Obviously, both phones being Moto G Stylus phones do have styluses. As far as performance goes, I really haven't noticed a huge notable difference between the two. Neither of them are nearly as good as the stylus on the Samsung Galaxy S22 Ultra, so you're not going to be doing any actual art with them, but for more basic activities like taking handwritten notes, navigating through your display and stuff like that, they will get the job done. Another thing to keep in mind is that with the Moto G Stylus 5G, we do get NFC, whereas the Moto G Stylus 4G, for whatever reason, doesn't have NFC. So if you like to make contactless mobile payments using tap and pay, then the Moto G Stylus 5G will have an advantage there. But in conclusion, which of these phones is better? Honestly, I feel like Motorola could have done a much better job making these phones at least a little bit more different, because in so many areas, these phones are nearly identical. But that being said, I personally would choose the Moto G Stylus 5G just because this phone does have 5G connectivity, and it has NFC, which I personally use quite a bit. But that being said, honestly, if you got the Moto G Stylus 4G instead, you really won't go wrong with this phone either, because even though on paper the Moto G Stylus 5G does have a few advantages, like a slightly higher refresh rate, slightly better fast charging, and a more powerful processor, in practice, when you're actually using these phones, you're not going to notice that much of a difference either way. But that being said, despite this, both phones are really good devices, and if you're looking for a solid mid-range phone with decent performance, a good camera, a great display, and a really good battery, you won't go wrong with either of them. But this concludes my comparison between the Motorola Moto G Stylus 5G 2022 and the Motorola Moto G Stylus 4G 2022. Again, if you want to learn more about either of these phones individually, I will be linking to several other videos about them in the description, as well as some information about pricing and availability, because this is always changing. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Kalipus Tech on Twitter and Instagram, and as always, I will see you in the next video.